17th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2014. Could everyone please make sure that the mobile phones and other electronic devices are on either silent or switched to airplane mode? Linda Fabiani has sent apologies for today as she's busy with work related to the Smith Commission. We have a slightly unusual committee meeting today to take account of the fact that it's Remembrance Day, marking 100 years since the start of World War I. The presiding officer has invited everyone to the garden lobby to take part in a special wreath-laying ceremony and to observe 2 minutes silence. To allow the committee to participate, we will be calling a break at 10:40. We will then reconvene after the ceremony and move straight into our final agenda item. Our first agenda item this morning, though, is a session with the Scottish Government to allow members to ask questions on the discretionary housing payment limit on total expenditures revocation Scotland Order 2014. And in order to do that, I welcome the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, Nicola Sturgeon, and one of our officials, Owen Griffith. On the 12th of August, the committee considered the Scotland Act 1998 transfer of functions to the Scottish Ministers, etc. Order 2014. It enables Scottish Ministers to determine the limit of local authority DHP expenditure and will apply from 2014-15 onwards. The order came into force on the 5th of November 2014 after approval by the Privy Council. Now that the power has been devolved, the Scottish Government has laid a second order subject to negative procedure revoking those enactments that impose the cap on DHPs. The committee was given advance notice of the order by the Scottish Government before it was formally laid in order to facilitate its quick progress through Parliament. This is the version which was included in the papers in advance of today. The committee would like to thank the Deputy First Minister for extending us this consideration. We will formally report on the instrument in a couple of weeks' time when we've laid the order and the report from the Delegated Powers Committee. However, we thought that we'd better take the opportunity to hear from the Deputy First Minister while we still can. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. You've very ably covered the reason for us being here today and the background to this issue. I'm grateful to the committee for giving me the opportunity to come along here today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions members have. I think the first thing I want to do is thank the committee for its scrutiny of the Section 63 order on the 12th of August. Indeed, thank you, Convener, and the committee for the part you played in helping to secure the smooth passage of the order through its parliamentary stages. I think it's also appropriate for me to put on record my thanks to David Mundell at the Scotland Office and to our respective officials who've worked to a very challenging timescale to get this order through the parliamentary stages in order that we can lay the policy order that we're here to talk about today. Just to recap very, very briefly, the Section 63 order was made by Her Majesty in Council on the 5th of November and it came into effect on the 6th of November. The Section 63 order transfers the power that is found in Section 70, subsection 3, subsection A of the Child Support, Pensions and Social Security Act 2000 to set the cap on the amount local authorities may spend on discretionary housing payments in a financial year. On the 6th of November, under the powers newly transferred to Scottish Ministers, I made the discretionary housing payments limit on total expenditure revocation Scotland Order 2014, and this order will come into effect on the 9th of December. As the committee can see, this is a simple order. It revoked two provisions that set the cap on local authority DHP expenditure at 2.5 times the total the DWP allocates to local authorities to spend on DHPs in any financial year. These articles are being revoked so that in future there will be no limit on the amount that local authorities in Scotland can spend on DHPs, and the committee will note that this is in line with the intention that I set out on the 12th of August, stating that the DHP cap would be removed in its entirety rather than simply being set at a higher level. Local authorities have already acted to spend funds distributed by the Scottish Government to mitigate the bedroom tax. They've done that on assurances that were offered by the DWP, by the Scottish Government and the Scotland Office back in June this year. I understand that DHPs are being made to those who need them, and I await the publication of the latest statistics on the 25th of November, which I anticipate will confirm this. So, as such, and given that local authorities have been mitigating in this way, individuals affected by the bedroom tax shouldn't notice any difference after this order comes into effect. The passage of it, however, does meet the commitment made to local authorities so that they can continue making payments up to the end of this financial year and in future years with confidence that they're able to spend what is needed. My last point, Convener, is just to draw to the committee's attention. The committee will be aware of this already, of course, that funding has been provided in the draft budget for next year, and I understand the committee will consider the draft budget next week. Funding that will allow the bedroom tax to be mitigated next year. The passage of this order will simplify the distribution of funds to local authorities and ensure that payments to individuals need not be interrupted. So that's the background and the effect of the order we're discussing today, and I would welcome the views of the committee, and as I said at the outset, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Deputy First Minister. Can I start by just clarifying, are there any discussions still ongoing with officials from the DWP around the order, or have they concluded? Is there anything that still remains to be finalised, or are we just progressing on the basis that things will take their course? Yeah,
I mean, the power has now transferred from the UK Government, in other words the DWP, to the Scottish Government. This policy order that we're discussing today is what we require to do in order to remove the cap, which we've been given power to do. So it's not dependent on ongoing discussions with the DWP. Perhaps one point just to make clear, which obviously still is dependent on DWP decision making. It's not related to this order, it's related to decisions about the amount of money the DWP will allocate to local authorities for discretionary housing payments next year. That's not yet finalised, and obviously the money we provide tops that up. So, you know, that's something that we still have to wait and see the final decision on. But in terms of this order, this is an order that is purely within the remit of the Scottish Government.
And obviously then at the other end of it, the local authorities, there must be discussions still ongoing with them. Are there any issues that are arising in relation to this that might be worth our while being made aware of at the minute, in case we have to look at them at some point in the future?
Well, the key issue is, again, not related to this order, but related to the allocation of funding for next year. There is a proposal that has been prepared for consideration with COSLA, because we seek to do these things by agreement. It's not yet been finally agreed, but it recommends the allocation, and broadly speaking it recommends that the significant chunk of money is allocated, with some held over in order to see the actual pattern of local authority spend throughout the year, so that any adjustments can be made at a later stage to take account of that. I'm happy by correspondence to keep the committee updated with the progress of these discussions.
Now, that would be very welcome. I'll open up to the committee to ask questions. Alex.
There were fears that some local authorities may have become reluctant to go on paying out if they had reached their limit before the change took place, in spite of the assurances that were given. I take it from your opening statement that no local authority got to the position where it had overspent the previous limit before the new arrangements come into place.
Owen may want to add some detail of that, but the letter of comfort that I referred to that was issued with assurances from the Government and the DWP and the Scotland Office was intended to take account of that. So it gave local authorities an assurance that should they get into a position where they were overspending, they were able to do that without, you know, fear of overstepping the remit. And of course now, once this order is in place, there is no limit, so local authorities are free to spend however much they want.
No local authority got to that position.
Do you want to?
A number of authorities did reach the, or we expect will have reached the cap level. We won't know for sure until we have statistics at the end of November, but from our projections towards the beginning of the year, a number were expected to reach the cap in this month, last month, and over the next couple of months, obviously. We understand that local authorities have continued to make DHP payments over the cap. That's not especially unusual. A similar situation applied last year when the DHP made its own, the DWP made its own changes to the DHP cap and assured local authorities they could spend money in that year in anticipation of legal change. So it's just the same situation as that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the statistics are due out on the 25th of November, which will show whether the projections are accurate and whether local authorities and what local authorities did breach that cap. The DWP, as you will recall, made some changes last year to how the cap was calculated. It previously was calculated that local authorities could spend 2.5 times the initial DWP allocation at the start of a financial year. They changed that last year because they'd made some top-ups themselves to make it 2.5 times the total amount that the DWP, and the same assurance process was put in place so that local authorities, if they breached the cap before that change was formally made, were able to do so. But I think the key point for us and the key point for you, I'm sure, in terms of the impact on individuals, is that because of the letter of reassurance, no local authority has effectively put payments to individuals on hold because they were reaching or had reached a cap.
The situation with funding is now well understood, but we've spoken to people who have housing-related debt that comes from a previous year. Are the funds made available through this measure designed to deal specifically with liabilities incurred in the current financial year, or can they be used against debts accrued in previous years?
Well, the principal objective of the funds that the Scottish Government is making available is to mitigate the bedroom tax and to mitigate the bedroom tax in the financial year that the funds relate to. As I think I said the previous occasion I was in front of the committee about this issue, local authorities have discretion to spend more or to use underspends in previous years if they so wish to make payments to individuals relating to arrears accrued because of the bedroom tax, but that would be a decision for local authorities themselves to take. The money that we are providing to local authorities is for the mitigation of the bedroom tax in the financial year the money relates to. So last year that would have been for last year. The year ahead it will be for 2015-16.
But sufficient flexibility would exist with individual local authorities within other parts of the budget that goes into the discretionary housing fund to allow them to decide if they wish to pursue that or not? There
is £50 million available between the DWP allocation. I'll caveat that immediately with what I said earlier on. We don't yet know what the final DWP allocation will be this year, and the £35 million, the top-up from the Scottish Government. Now, our estimate of what the mitigation of the bedroom tax will cost is around £44 million, just under £44 million. So there is other funding within that total for other uses. There was also previously in previous year an under spend on the £20 million. If you remember, in 2013-14, the Scottish Government made £20 million available. The underspend in that was not clawed back by the Scottish Government. That money remained with local authorities. So there would be discretion, and I'm not sitting here saying I expect local authorities to do this. It's entirely a matter for local authority discretion to decide whether they would want to make payments relating to any legacy arrears.
Exists and discretion lies with local
authorities.
There
is flexibility, and ultimately, this is a point we have made repeatedly before. The responsibility and indeed the right of deciding how discretionary housing payments are used lies with local authorities, although we're making very clear the money we are providing is for the mitigation of the bedroom tax.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just first of all clarify a couple of points? My understanding from the Section 63 order is that the power now to lift this cap is permanently with the Scottish Government. The order before us today, the revocation order, however, that applies for 1 year, is that right? In other words, does it apply simply for the year 2014-2015? And if we wish to, if we want to lift the cap for local authorities for discretionary payments next year, the Scottish Government will have to produce another order?
No, this order would continue unless it was repealed.
It is. It's a permanent. No, I was just the way I was reading it. It says, I think, that's right. One version of it says it applies from the financial year, but another one says it applies. I think within within the 2014-15 financial year, but it applies from now on.
Yes, I mean, it is a
event.
permanent order until such times as a Scottish Government chose to repeal it.
That's fine. And if I may just go looking backwards now rather than forwards, and following the point that Al Johnson raised, can I just double check? I can see from your intention that the money it's entirely up to local authorities to make discretionary payments as they see fit. I just double check though, are any of the monies coming from either the DWP or the Scottish Government ring fenced in any way for DHP payments, or can they be used by the local authority to mitigate in other ways?
The DWP, the allocation they make, they put. I don't know if ring fence would be the correct way of describing it, because I think it's still open to local authorities to spend DHPs in the way they see fit, but they nominally allocate particular amounts of the overall allocation to things like the bedroom tax, the benefit cap, for example. And the responsibility for deciding how to spend DHPs legally lies with local authorities. That said, I have made very clear to local authorities, the government has made very clear to local authorities that the money we are providing to top up the DWP allocation for DHPs is for mitigation of the bedroom tax, and secondly that we expect everybody who is affected by the bedroom tax who applies for a DHP to get one. In other words, there should be no other means test applied to those decisions.
I think the problem or the concern is that some people won't apply. So it's just there's two things. There's the trying to reach those, and trying to help those individuals, and the second thing is the budget yourself. You passed these £50 million to the local authorities. You've said that you've not clawed it back in previous years, so there's an expectation you're suggesting that it won't be clawed back. This is money for them. The local authorities can budget on the basis that they have this £50 million to allocate through DHPs or other welfare mitigation schemes, and you won't, if they don't draw it down, you won't be asking for it back.
We're not. We want this money to be spent on helping people with the impact of welfare cuts. I think we've got into a position here that is, how can I put this, as good a position as it's possible to get us into, given that we're dealing with a policy that's not of our making. So your point about people still have to apply for DHPs is absolutely correct. It's a point, I laboured, and in fact I think I answered a question from you on this point in the statement I made to Parliament when we got the agreement to transfer this power. Absolutely. We still, local authorities, housing associations, all of us have to encourage people who are affected by the bedroom tax to apply for this help. I'm not going to beat about the bush here. This is the best position we can get into given what we're dealing with, but it is second best. The best position here is not to have a bedroom tax, so that nobody's in the position of having to apply for help because we don't have a bedroom tax in the first place. But I'm not able to abolish the bedroom tax, if only I was. But what I'm therefore having to do is find the best way of mitigating the bedroom tax. It will be imperfect in some ways, inevitably, and one of the imperfections is that it does rely on people applying. But that's unfortunately the position that we're in.
No, and you've made your position clear on that. I think the point I'm trying to get to is that I suppose it's part of it is about the certainty that local authorities will have over control of this particular budget. If, for example, the bedroom tax, the cost of mitigating the bedroom tax comes to 44 million, but you're providing 50 million, they will have $6 million extra to use to help residents in their own area using DHPs or other devices. And that money, what I'm just checking is that you've got no intention of clawing that money.
No, the £50 million that local authorities have, they have certainty about. And, the bedroom tax has, for understandable and very legitimate reasons, captured a lot of the focus around the issues that people are getting into here. But there are other consequences of welfare cuts that will lead to people applying for discretionary housing payments. So local authorities have certainty about the £50 million. They are also free, and I accept readily that local authority finances are strapped, as everybody's finances are, but local authorities are free if they so choose to top up further. That's the beauty of taking the cap away completely. Local authorities, if they want to and if they can access the resource, could spend even more than the 50 million that we are, through the DWP and the Scottish Government, making available.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Kevin? Thank you, Convener. And the Deputy First Minister has partly answered my question. Obviously, this is extremely welcome, but the best solution to all of this would be to abolish the bedroom tax completely and utterly. Will the Scottish Government continue to lobby the Westminster Government for that abolition so that we don't have to tinker around at the edges like we're doing with this transfer of powers to allow the cap and DHP to be lifted?
Yes, I will. I mean, as I said to Ken McIntosh, we're getting ourselves into the best position for the people affected as we can, but it's not an ideal position. So I will do two things. I will firstly continue to argue very strongly that the UK Government itself should repeal the bedroom tax. I have to say I don't hold out too much hope of that happening at this stage, but I will continue to make that case. And secondly, I'll continue to argue, and I hope others will argue the same case, that power over this should be devolved to this Parliament as part of the process that's underway just now. There is I was going to say subsidiary issue here, but it's more than a subsidiary issue. You know, there are parties involved in the Smith Commission process just now, other than the SNP, who advocate the devolution of housing benefit. If we're to get to the position where that is to be meaningful, then we need to stop a process that is underway right now, or at least put it on hold, that is abolishing housing benefit by subsuming it into universal credit. So if that discussion is going to be allowed to take place meaningfully, then we don't just need to argue for that. We need to stop things that are happening in parallel that make that impractical.
Thank you.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Deputy First Minister. Just a brief question on the timing of the Section 63 order. So I understand that the UK Government agreed to devolve this power at the beginning of May. And am I right in saying that the timetable thereafter has really been dictated by the processes involved, particularly as far as the Westminster end is concerned?
Yes, in short, although to be fair to the UK Government and to the Scotland office, I think it is reasonable to say it's happened as quickly as those processes would have allowed. You know, we can all argue that these processes are too long and too cumbersome, but they are the processes that are there. So, you know, the timetable that David Mundell and I set out in May has largely been adhered to. In fact, we had built in a bit of contingency to allow, I think, the order to be passed in Council in December if we didn't meet the November timescale, but we did meet the November timescale. So, you know, I'm satisfied that, you know, whether there's an argument to shorten some of these processes, generally in future we've stuck to the timetable that we thought we would do. That, though, because you're right, it has been a long time. May to November is not a short period of time for something that is relatively straightforward. That's why the letter of assurance became so important, because we did project that local authorities would start to hit off the cap, and it was important that they had the comfort that they needed in order that didn't start to interrupt payments to individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Just about to come up against time, Deputy First Minister, but can I just clarify one thing in relation to the local authorities again? Ken McIntosh has touched on this. We understand the money that's been available through DHP, but some local authorities had made representations to the committee to say that they had alternative preferred options for getting money to those who were being hit by the bedroom tax. Are discussions with those local authorities still ongoing, or have they accepted that DHP is the only way that this money can now be taken forward? Well,
we've had no issues raised with us by local authorities looking for alternative ways of mitigating the bedroom tax since we issued the letter of comfort. The alternatives that were being mooted at an earlier stage were being mooted effectively as alternatives or as contingencies if we hadn't had the power to lift the cap transferred. I have no doubt in my mind that the best option is to abolish the bedroom tax, but short of that, this is the best way to mitigate the bedroom tax. And we've had no alternatives put forward by local authorities. If any local authorities want to discuss any issue with us along these lines, of course we'd be happy to have that discussion. But as far as I am aware, local authorities are content with this as the correct way within the confines of the policy we work within to mitigate the bedroom tax.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Deputy First Minister. As I mentioned earlier, we'll deal with item 2 at a future meeting, which is the consideration of the order. So I'll suspend the meeting now to allow a short break and the opportunity for those who wish to attend the remembrance ceremony in the Garden Lobby to make their way just now. But before doing so, can I just, on behalf of the committee, thank you for the way that you've engaged with the committee and made yourself so readily available when we needed to discuss issues, and the level of communication you've had. I know that my clerks appreciate the support that they've had from your staff, and obviously under your leadership for that. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you very much for the way you've engaged with us.
And my thanks to the committee. You've been a pleasure to work with.
Okay. I'll suspend the committee as agreed. open this morning's meeting and go to our agenda item 3, which is an evidence session on further devolution of welfare powers to Scotland. And we are joined around the table today by a range of academics, and I would like to welcome Professor David Bell, the Professor of Economics at the University of Stirling, Professor Ken Gibb, Professor in Housing Economics and Director of Public Policy at the University of Glasgow, Dr Jim McCormick, Scotland Advisor to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Professor Nicola McEwen, Professor of Territorial Politics at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Paul Spicker, our previous advisor on the budget, who's appearing this morning in a personal capacity, and Dr David Webster, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow. And thank you to you all for making yourselves available to us this morning to discuss what is obviously a very important issue. In order to start the ball rolling, I thought I would go back to a discussion that I had last week in my capacity as a member of the Finance Committee, where we also had a number of academics, eminent academics, who wanted to discuss this issue, not specifically welfare, but wider fiscal issues. We're focusing on welfare issues. But during the discussion last week, we did get onto welfare issues, and one of the academics, Professor John Kay, boiled the argument down quite simply to it being an issue of one that it's difficult to unpick welfare issues, and he suggested that either we do it all or don't do it at all. So I just wonder, given that you all have given submissions which have various takes and caveats on the prospect of various welfare issues being devolved, whether you agree with Professor Kay or do you have your own perspective on what are the areas where we can devolve fairly easily and where it would be practically impossible to do so within a United Kingdom setting. And to start the ball rolling, I'll go to our former budget advisor, Professor Spicker, to put you on the spot, but I'll certainly open that question up to all of you to make a contribution. Paul.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. I've certainly some sympathy with John Kay's position. The difficulty is not simply that the benefit system is complicated, but that all changes, whatever they are, run considerable risks for some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our society. And we have to approach whatever is done with great care. The benefit system is complex. There are many interactions. The benefits interact with each other. They interact with the tax system. They interact with other social services, most notably health and social care. Whatever we do with benefits, it's likely that those benefits will be tied and have implications for other parts of the system. So we must always be aware that that's a likelihood. There's been a certain consensus in a number of the documents produced that we may get a devolution of housing benefit and that we may get a devolution of attendance allowance. Both of those benefits are tied to other benefits in an important way. Housing benefit less so, but it's quite clear that it's not possible to devolve housing benefit without reconsidering the structure of the universal credit system. And attendance allowance has a substantial overlap with disability living allowance and personal independence payment because of the particular situation where people over retirement age get extensions when on DLA or PIP. Now, those sorts of things have to be thought through, and often I think what people are looking for is the idea that a benefit is somehow detachable from other parts of the conditions that are being dealt with. Typically they're not, and you either have to look for an entire client group set of circumstances and have to look at the way that the links are severed, or you have to transfer things either together or don't transfer them. The paper which I've submitted is very much concerned with the implications of partial devolution of some powers without the devolution of others. The sorts of problems which immediately arise are issues of financial coordination. We can't have the situation where basically one government gives benefit and another government takes it away or taxes it. There are administrative complications because it's not as often as simple as saying this person will receive benefits from us when they may also be receiving benefits from another from another source in another territory. And there are the perennial problems of the interaction of one benefit with another, especially where benefits are alternative to each other. It would be very difficult, for example, I think, to manage pension benefits separately from each other because of the direct interaction of pension credit and the state pension. It's not impossible, but it has to be done with great care, and one always has to consider what the outcomes would be for the people who are most likely to be affected. What I would say in general is that, as a principle of devolution, is that if there is to be a devolution of benefits, then I think we need to accept that the terms of benefits will vary. There isn't much point in devolution if the terms of benefits don't vary, if they are going to be completely uniform. So what I would propose for, I think really anybody considering this to consider, is almost the opposite of the parity principle in Northern Ireland, where they work on the principle that the system must be unified, must be the same, and therefore they move in very close, indeed often identical form to what's happening in London. Now that really isn't a devolved principle, and I would suggest that if we're going to begin with anything, or if we're looking at any form of devolution, we need to be talking about almost the opposite, the presumption that it is legitimate and desirable for benefit conditions to be different.
Our colleagues want to make a contribution? Professor Bell?
I had the pleasure of coming in today with a retired professor of history from Stirling, who reminded me actually that Scotland had a different poor law from the rest of the UK until, well, pre-war certainly. So there was a different system for quite a while. There are huge difficulties, as Paul has illustrated, around different benefits, around the interaction between benefits and their interaction with the tax system, and putting in place any new system, even irrespective of that, is going to cost. There's just no question about that. What I guess I've tried to do in my paper is slightly to gloss over those issues, which I think are very real, and think about the kind of macro implications of this. So if you did decide that you could devolve some part of the welfare system, what implications for public funding would that have, and what implications for the overall macroeconomic stance of the UK government? If you do it in relation to Scotland, and then probably the issue is relatively small. If you start thinking about having different welfare systems across different parts of the UK, then it becomes much more important. So if you, for example, thought about attendance allowance, then what essentially would need to happen is that there's some transfer from DWP, implicitly the Treasury, to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government has this cash sum and then decides to allocate that in its own way to the needs of people. Well, it's the needs of people who are requiring personal care. Then the question is, how is that adjustment done? And you fall back on exactly the same issue that you've got with the Scottish rate of income tax. How do you adjust the block grant to reflect this new reality? And the question then about the size of that is, implicitly what you're doing is making a decision about what risks you're sharing and what risks you're now taking on board as a Scottish Government and will deal with in your own way. I mean, with attendance allowance, we've already got the free personal care policy. You might argue the case that there's an overlap there, that people's circumstances could be improved. Equally, that might not happen, but you would be taking on the risk of dealing with that situation.
Gibb, and then Dr McCormick, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to think about housing benefit in particular, since it's the example that most people have talked about as a readily devolvable benefit. And I should also start by saying that I haven't submitted any written evidence because I'm working with a colleague, Mark Stevens, at Heriot-Watt for Shelter Scotland, and we're just about to publish a report about the options for devolving housing benefit, and obviously make that available when it's done. I think the thing about housing benefit is that you've got to ask why would you devolve it? What's the benefit or the advantage of it? And originally, I think it's been discussed in the context of the bedroom tax. It's a way in which a Scottish Government could, in some way, get rid of the problem as they see it, the bedroom tax. But of course, in a few months' time, that may not be a live issue anyway, if the UK election changes the attitudes that government has about that. So that's one issue. A second issue is that a number of parties, a number of people, a number of the submissions around the Smith Commission have suggested that the IPPR argument that you can safely devolve issues where either policy is, there's a kind of complement between the policy issue being devolved and the funding stream for it, and also that there's a stability around the funding levels, that they made the case that those two arguments apply to housing benefit, and therefore housing benefit should be devolved. I think that's certainly questionable on the grounds that housing benefit isn't stable. The private rented element of housing benefit is not stable, and there are parts of the housing system which are certainly reserved as opposed to devolved. Everything that happens, largely happens in the mortgage market, for instance, is reserved. That impacts on private renting, and that in turn impacts on social renting. It's a bit more murky than it appears. So to go back to the question, why would you devolve housing benefit? Well, it seems to me, and in previous work I did with my colleague Mark Stevens, we argued that you would reform housing benefit. You would devolve housing benefit because you want to reform it to make it better, to make it more progressive in some sense, to tackle some issues of inequality, some issues of efficiency and the like. And the problem that we had when we looked at this in 2012 was that really any control over housing benefit, if you wanted to make it more progressive, would almost certainly lead you to want to spend some more money or have the scope to do that. And you can't really do that if you simply just devolve housing benefit. So you get into issues of whether you are going to use other spending priorities and use them for that, or use tax powers to do that. Or alternatively, if you devolve more benefits, would you consider pooling that benefit income and redistributing it in some way to increase housing benefits? So to cut a long story short, I think that it may seem ostensibly simple and easy to devolve housing benefit, but as with many of these issues, and the issues David just raised with attendance allowance, there are all sorts of complexities and knock-on effects that have to be considered, let alone thinking about the universal credit issue that Paul raised.
Dr McCormick.
Thank you, Convener. Before we get into some of the real specifics, I guess our starting point would be there are some feasible options between the two extremes that Professor Kay has suggested. And you could read the mandate of the referendum as saying people want to remain in some kind of social and economic union with the UK, but they also want that union to change, and that further devolution in this area is a reasonable and feasible part of that change process. I guess our starting point is, before we start unpicking bits of the settlement and ask which benefit X or Y looks right, is to think about which tests we might apply to make sure that further devolution is feasible, affordable, is going to help with various tests. So, for example, poverty reduction would be our primary purpose. Is further devolution going to help towards those ends? And one of the most important principles, we think, is insofar as we are embarking on further devolution, as far as possible, the demand side drivers that add pressure and costs into the system ought to be managed at the same time. For example, if we're looking at the way in which the working age offer might be reformed, there's a proposal to devolve the work programme, turn it into a Scottish version, perhaps decentralise it. That's fine as far as it goes, but better would also be to add into that pot, to make it more coherent, would be to look at what kind of benefits go along with that devolution of the work programme, and what kind of conditionality regime, so that you've got both opportunities and responsibilities going alongside that. Ultimately, we want to get into a position where further devolution is financed in a way that the savings that flow from better programme performance in Scotland flow back into Scotland. So there's an incentive to invest in social investment approaches around training and childcare and so on. And that any additional costs through higher expenditure or poorer performance are also within that core part of the Scottish budget. So there's a grown-up approach to further devolution. I think that's in everyone's interests. And probably the arguments for further devolution are strongest of all in areas of housing and labour markets and childcare, because of the way in which those markets vary, because of their importance in terms of adding costs into the system, and therefore the importance of managing them. And so, we would say it is feasible, it's tricky, but it's feasible to map out a coherent approach to further devolution, particularly in those areas of housing, labour markets and childcare.
Okay. Dr Webster, you want to comment?
Yes. Well, like Jim, I flatly disagree with Professor Kay, and I would point to the fact that the Scottish Parliament, of course, has already varied the social security system in these three important respects in relation to the bedroom tax, which we were talking about this morning, the council tax rebate scheme, and the abolition of the social fund. And I don't think anybody really claims that the knock-on effects of variation in those areas are anything to worry about. In fact, I can't recall anybody's mentioned any knock-on effects. So I think there clearly are things that you can do to vary the social security system without causing any ill effects, although I thoroughly agree with Paul that you have to be very careful about knock-on effects, because social security systems are complicated and do interact with other things. I think, if I may, I'll also highlight another disagreement with Professor Bell, who I normally agree with almost everything about. One disagreement I have is in his submission to the committee. He says that variations in the social security system should not be based on dissatisfaction with aspects of existing policy. Well, I would definitely say absolutely the opposite. As you'll see from my paper, I think it's clear that differences in attitudes to social security have caused enormous friction and tension in the union, and I think it's important to provide a mechanism whereby those frictions can be mitigated. So what I've suggested in my paper is that there should be a general presumption that in a political union you share a common social security system for the reasons that I mentioned in my first paragraph, such as mobility of labour, social solidarity and so on. But there should be a general power for the Scottish Parliament to vary any aspect of the social security system, provided that it meets the cost. And I've suggested also that it should be a two-way street. Ken mentioned that the bedroom tax issue, for instance, may disappear after the next election, next UK election. Well, I think there should be provision for things to be undevolved, re-centralised when there's no need. If the need for a different provision in Scotland disappears, then why continue a separate system? It shouldn't be a case of looking at things, we can devolve this, we can devolve that, and so on, and then that's forever. Why should it be? In my opinion, there should be a presumption that you're running a common social security system, and that, so far as possible, that's the goal that should be held in sight. But there's no point people blinding themselves to the fact that social security is one of the issues that has caused the most ill feeling in the union, particularly in the period since 1979. And I think that has to be addressed.
Okay. And Professor McEwen, I'll give you the opportunity before going to other members of the committee.
Yes, I agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said, and I have sympathy with Professor Kay's perspective, given the complexity that partial devolution would inevitably bring. However, I think even if you devolve all social security, there's still going to be complexity because of the interdependence between social security and those other areas, whether it's mortgage rates or macroeconomic policy, or the broader economic factors that social security interacts with. couple of things I would want to state. I think we're talking a lot about devolving benefits. I think we need to make a distinction between whether we're talking about devolving benefits or devolving a function that those benefits serve, because those are very different forms of devolution with different implications. So if you are devolving only a benefit, then that will probably come with many more constraints on what the Scottish Parliament would be able to do with that new power than if you're devolving the function that that benefit serves. That might also affect whether further devolution would meet the kinds of challenges that Jim set out. And I think that's a really good approach to identify the challenges that you're trying to address. Second thing is that I think inevitably the greater complexity will mean that there will be greater need to manage the interdependence between what is devolved, if there is indeed more social security devolution, and what is reserved. So social security would effectively become a shared or concurrent policy area. Now, we don't have very many of these in the UK system of devolution. I think we're about to get some. And there needs to be a way to manage these things. And that's usually done in a very informal and ad hoc way in the intergovernmental system, which means there's never very much of a role for the Parliament or for parliamentary scrutiny. And I think that's something that you might want to be careful about. But managing interdependence is going to be a key challenge.
Up to committee members to ask questions. Kevin, to be followed by Alec.
Thank you, Convener. And Professor Spicker, and in what he said, mentioned universal credit and personal independence payments. Obviously, we have the ongoing welfare reforms as we're having this discussion about further devolution. Do the panellists think it would be wise to halt the rollout of universal credit and personal independence payments in Scotland until we actually reach that devolution settlement, so that we don't have to do further unpicking of something? If Professor Spicker first, I think, Convener.
I'm in something of a quandary here, because my general view is that universal credit should be halted regardless, and that does, I think, create a difficulty. Let's say, considering by what mechanism could universal credit be done more effectively. The great difficulty of universal credit is not only that it's meant to be a benefit which supplants a wide range of other benefits, but that it's supposed to introduce a marginal rate of deduction which would mean that as people's income increased, that they would not lose more than 65 pence in the pound. That principle was already breached immediately when council tax reduction was introduced. Taxation hasn't been included, so that's not within the marginal rate of deduction. Housing benefit, I think, cannot exist side by side with the universal credit as currently it exists, because you cannot basically manage the interaction of something taking 50 pence in the pound with something that is supposed to take 65 pence in the pound without altering the rates substantially. Now, it may be that somebody will come up with a complex mathematical formula. We've seen lots of those in the past to make that possible, but I think that it would be extremely difficult to introduce universal credit in Scotland in anything like its intended form if housing benefit were not part of the scheme. My reservation about that as a general statement, of course, is that what's going to happen with universal credit in any case is that we're already seeing that realistically it is compartmentalised, that it does have a series of different aspects within it which all have to work to different rules, and though the problems of managing that have made it all but impossible to administer the benefit in the format that it was intended to be in. And I am surprised that it has not undergone very substantial reform simply in order to cope with that.
Thank you. I think, in a sense, all roads lead to universal credit in making decisions around different parts of working age benefits. And this may be a minority position on the panel, but JRF's view is we support many of the principles behind universal credit, but we would like to see it designed in a very different way to give it a fighting chance. For example, in the way that Northern Ireland might be able to design it differently. In, for example, treatment of housing costs, in, for example, payment frequencies, and who within the household receives payment individually or couples. So freeing up all of those and other issues could start to give this thing a fighting chance. Why does it remain important? For example, people at the bottom end of the jobs market who are moving in and out of work frequently, stopping and starting claims for multiple benefits, are the people who face the biggest poverty traps, the biggest problems in terms of insecurity of income, let alone insecurity of earnings. And so potentially something like universal credit could be a big step forward. In terms of the Scottish debate, I think it's worth going back to the expert welfare group report, working group report on welfare, which reported last June. Now that was in the context of if Scotland had voted yes for independence, but there are many strengths to the analysis in that report that was done in Scotland, which talked about creating a social security allowance in Scotland, which would have universal credit-like features, but would take housing costs out of it. I think it's a very strong case for further integration, not less integration. For example, bringing council tax reduction into the fold, allowing for future reforms to local taxation in Scotland, and allowing for a more generous approach to work allowances or childcare. There's a lot we could do in Scotland long term to keep the principle of integration, improve it, make it more generous for lower paid workers. And I'm kind of loath to ditch the principles. So in terms of your question, it would be much better if we were further down the track and saw what this thing was like in practice, not just for single unemployed claimants who are the easier cases, but people with children, people with disabilities and so on. So at the moment, I think it's important that we really do understand the early evaluation evidence and can take an informed view on what kind of timescale would we want to in Scotland devolve aspects of universal credit, keep them together as far as possible, or do we want to negotiate with DWP some kind of, as Nicholas said, some kind of concurrent approach to universal credit, which would allow us to vary, if not benefit rates to start with, and certainly some design principles. I think Northern Ireland provides an interesting potential precedent already for that kind of devolution in terms of design of UC.
That's David.
Yes, well, I agree with what's been said. There's just an important practical difference between PIP and universal credit. Universal credit, as I understand, it's only been extended to about 12,000 claimants, and none of the computer system has been commissioned. So having a moratorium is quite easy. But with PIP, we've got the opposite problem, that we've got a backlog of several 100,000 people who've made new claims who've not been assessed and are waiting for benefit payment to, with a considerable hardship. So a moratorium is not really what we would want in the case of PIP. I think the thing is actually to speed up the rollout of PIP and then talk about alteration in the rules later.
If I can come back on that point, because there's always the possibility of reverting to the status quo. And with both of these, universal credit and personal independence payment, we seem to have an extremely bureaucratic system. And in one case, where the systems aren't actually complete, and that's in the case of universal credit. Professor Spicker mentioned complex mathematical formula. Is the system as it stands with these welfare reforms so overly bureaucratised that you might get to the point where you're spending as much money in the bureaucracy than you are on helping the people who need it most?
Do you want to take that? We've had this issue raised in relation to the Scottish Welfare Fund, where it's a £33 million fund, but the information that's coming to us from COSLA is that the administration of that £33 million fund is somewhere in the region of 4.8 million to 8.3 million. And there are questions asked about the extent of the bureaucracy to administer what is a relatively small fund. Do colleagues have a view on that?
point of administration. My understanding is that with universal credit, once it's established, because it's a new system, it will be able to accommodate differences on a regional basis within England and, potentially within the devolved areas if there were moderate differences, not substantial ones. That's not as likely to be possible with some of the older systems for processing benefits. So that limits what you could achieve if you wanted to go down the road of continuing to share bureaucracy in order to share some of those costs. On your original question about halting the rollout, I mean, I'm not going to comment on PIP or whether these reforms are good or bad things, but I think it seems eminently sensible to me to pause and await the outcome of this current process of reforming devolution, which, after all, is pretty speedy, and we probably ought not to have to wait too long under current timetable. So it's going to be much easier. It's not going to be easy at all, but it would be much harder to start to unpack things after they have changed rather than before. The one thing I would say, though, yes, we can revert to the status quo. My concern with a lot of the discussions we have around devolution of social security and indeed devolution of some other things is that there is a bit of a tendency to want to halt changes and to revert to a status quo and to preserve certain things. And what I would hope to see, if there was further devolution, is perhaps a rethinking about other possibilities of what you might be able to do with powers, to think about how these things might be redesigned within Scotland to suit Scottish needs rather than always to revert to a status quo. And that's a capacity issue for this Parliament, for think tanks and so on, for us as well.
Paul wanted to come in, Kevin, sorry, just on that point.
I wanted to reply to the point about complexity. I think it's a very important point. Complexity is, well, what can I say? Obviously, it's not a straightforward topic. There are certain benefits that are too complicated for people to work out for themselves. One of them is a state pension. But it doesn't actually seem to matter when it comes to delivery. Then there are other benefits which in some ways are oversimplified, or benefit rules that are oversimplified. As I am tempted to say, the sanctions rules have been disastrously oversimplified, which cause terrible problems for people. So it's not straightforwardly a matter of saying, oh, we must avoid all calculations. I think that the great difficulty comes when we try to personalise benefits, when we try to tailor benefits carefully and sensitively to the needs of an individual on, the government has suggested, the basis of real time. The difficulty with that is that lots of people are unable to say what their income is, where their income comes from, what the sources are. This is what the accountants, for example, have said about the position of self-employed people in relation to universal credit. So rules which may seem to make sense can actually be hugely difficult to implement in practice. And one of the reasons that I've called in my submission for caution, for taking time to get it right, is precisely that there are so many wrinkles of this sort.
Kevin?
Just to clarify my point on the reverting to the status quo, that until we know what powers we actually are going to get, and then design that system round about the needs of the people of Scotland, rather than having something thrust upon us which many of us don't think will actually work and will actually be detrimental to people. Professor Spicker there talked about personalising things for folks' individual needs, convener. Is it possible to be able to personalise for individual needs if you don't have full control of both the benefit system and the tax system, so that we get this absolutely right in terms of each individual's needs?
Anyone want to have a go at that? David? You looked interested enough.
Well, I mean, I guess that's true, but it's still, I mean, it still might be a challenge for a Scottish government to find a system that will meet everyone's needs. I mean, I just think that possibly is something that would be almost beyond the complex mathematical formulae or the IT systems that are in place at the minute. So I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I think it would have its limitations.
Yeah, there are stronger arguments, I think, for devolution of power and responsibility. The principal one, and if I'm going to address a point that Professor Gibb raised about why would we want to devolve housing benefit, as much as anything else, it's because we wouldn't necessarily wish to maintain housing benefit in its existing form. That what we may want to do is to reallocate the budgets and responsibilities between housing benefit and other forms of housing subsidy and provision. That's what becomes possible with a devolved power, which is to do things differently. But I wouldn't necessarily wish to see a system being done differently by trying to be even more personalised than the real-time failures of universal credit have been.
Ken,
yeah, just to say that I think Paul's absolutely right. The issue is you want to devolve housing benefit or make changes to it in order to improve the system, as I said earlier. And one way of thinking about that is the overall housing budget and how you allocate resources. Another way, of course, is that housing benefit is itself fundamental to income maintenance. We are very unusual in the UK in that we don't have a general housing part of the income support system. We do it all through housing benefit, as it were. And one could imagine a world in which you did return an element of that housing element into the general cash payment, and you had a separate new housing allowance which did different things, like a gap system or something of that kind. But as with all of these issues, these are really long-term questions, and I mean, surely one of the lessons of universal credit over the last 3 or 4 years is how long it takes to do these things properly. And I think we couldn't imagine a quick turnaround.
Okay, I'll move on to another committee member. If I've got time, I'll come back to other members if they want to come back in. Alex, to be followed by Jamie.
I've got a couple of more general points, but there was a slightly more specific one that arose from discussion earlier on, and it was about the idea of devolving housing benefit initially. When we first talked about the structures for support, when council tax benefit was devolved, we got evidence from some people that suggested there was a significant inefficiency in the fact that the synergies between housing benefit and council tax benefit were lost. Do you see significant gains to be achieved in managing them in the same channel in Scotland?
Is that directed at anyone specifically, Alex? Or is it
well, if anybody's willing to answer.
Ken?
I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think one of the things about council tax benefit is that it's on a radically different taper to housing benefit, and there's clearly there's clearly a question there about the opportunities to try to integrate that a bit more, I suppose. I mean, in a sense, the broader issue, I guess, is something that Jim brought up, was that one may want to use this as an opportunity to link property taxation to the benefit system as well. That the council tax benefit operates for the council tax system, as it were, and that we, there obviously are powers that the Scottish Parliament already has to consider local government finance more broadly and local taxation more broadly. So that may be something that you would want to think about in an integrated way. Council tax benefit on one hand and council tax on the other, and how they are reformed. They're both housing related benefits, so in that sense it does make kind of sense to think about how they affect low income households at the same time. But in a sense, I think there's a broader agenda for housing benefit than there is for council tax benefit.
Mm-hmm. So does anybody else see a synergy in that, or anything else that could be brought together in that area?
I think that there is indeed some synergy. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that it would of itself lead to any substantial savings, but I think that something that we've seen developing in Scotland is an expertise in certain forms of benefit management in local authorities. And whereas clearly there's variation between local authorities, I don't think we should underestimate overall the administrative capacity that there is in Scotland to tackle this. Certainly I feel that within many of the benefit officers, there's a very substantial competence. The view from the central DWP seems to be that the reason why things go wrong is that their officials get it wrong all the time. There's a very different view, I think, from people behind the desks who are working extremely hard to get it right. And whenever a new direction comes, which can't be managed, then it has to be dealt with in a different way. I think that the DWP substantially underestimates the strengths and competence of its own local staff, and I think that equally there has been an underestimation of how far the local authorities have adapted. I think we can cope with a great deal more. That isn't necessarily an argument for doing it. It's an argument, though, to say that there isn't an obstacle of that sort should there be a desire to develop more by way of benefits, either locally or at Scottish level.
Alex?
Do you see an efficiency at local government level if there was additional responsibilities managed at that level, that you could see the same people managing more than one responsibility, whereas at the moment they seem to be working on the few responsibilities they have?
I am staggered by what their capacity to deal with what they have, so I wouldn't necessarily say it was the same people. I'm not sure that we can actually link this to productivity in quite that way, because what one tends to get with all of these things is the creation of new systems, and new systems always create new problems.
Mm-hmm. Jim?
Thank you. I think I would agree with Ken that there is a really important principle here about how much integration is going to be more efficient and lead to better outcomes for claimants. And while that's a judgment call, I think I'm almost certain we're nowhere near the optimal point of integration at the moment. And whatever we do in future, better integration of the different elements of housing finance would be a good thing in principle. How you do it depends on capacity and making sure we invest at the local level and maintaining that capacity. But integration is a good thing in principle. It's worth saying that housing costs overall are relatively lower in Scotland than the rest of Britain. That's a real advantage. It leads to, for example, relatively lower poverty rates over the last decade than we've seen elsewhere. The major a major cause for concern is what's been happening in the private rented sector, with the doubling of that sector, lots of people stuck in it long term who shouldn't be there because of lack of options in other tenures. And it may be that our licensing and regulation and planning powers, or for example what we might do with new borrowing or bond issuing powers to maximise the existing housing stock and increasing supply of affordable housing, that ultimately long term those are more or as important aspects of reforming these issues than just looking at housing benefits, for example, or council tax reduction in isolation. There are other powers around infrastructure capital investment where we might place affordable housing at the top of that list, arguably, which would long term reshape the market and drive down costs potentially. So we should be thinking broadly in terms of where are the drivers of cost inflation in the system, and as well as using the benefit system, can we use planning, licensing, regulation and other powers to manage these costs more effectively?
Mm-hmm. Professor Spicker said a minute ago that new systems produce new problems. The phrase I had in mind is, I had a definition of complexity for you. It's simplicity with patches. And the problem we have is that there are two alternative views of how this revolution might be achieved. I would perhaps argue the right way for responsibilities in this area to be passed to the Scottish Government is for the baton to be passed and then a change in direction to take place. But there appears to be an appetite in certain circles for a line in the sand, year zero approach, where all responsibilities are passed and we have a completely new system from the very start. How do you compare these two alternative approaches to how change might be achieved in Scotland?
You're talking on the one hand of a more incremental approach.
Pass the responsibility and then allow decisions to be made. But there seems to be an appetite to make some radical decisions to end the process that we're going through now and then start with something completely different.
On you go.
I was thinking of the recommendations of the expert group on welfare again, which was thinking about how to adapt in the context of independence. And even under those circumstances, they had recommended a more incremental approach with continuity and a longer term view as to how to implement change. I think while I said in relation to Kevin's point earlier about, how I would hope that new powers would bring imagination as to how to redesign things and do it differently, I think that has to be viewed as a longer term prospect. It would require policy thinking, it would require development, it would require institutions to be put in place, bureaucracy to put in place, and I think it would be absolutely essential that vulnerable people dependent upon benefits do not have those disrupted by political change. So I would personally favour a more sort of gradualist, longer
gradual divergence rather than one-day revolution.
Gradual devolution, I guess.
Critical thing, or a critical thing. I mean, we want to deliver the best system we possibly can, but then there's the question of how that is to be funded. Does the Scottish Government have the power to add to existing benefits? How would the any allocation from the UK Government to the Scottish Government in relation to the funding of welfare benefits be managed? It seems to me to be extremely important. Just as in the same way you would have the issue if you had an independent Scotland, how would you generate the revenues that would fund the welfare system? And Scotland, we've never had to really think about that before, and indeed the Treasury has not had to think about that kind of issue before, and that is just in the way that the rather boring block grant adjustment in relation to the Scottish rate of income tax is absolutely critical. The way that any change in the powers over welfare benefits is funded is also critical.
I would suggest that perhaps Scotland's answer to the revenue question when asked may be different from that many expect. However, that's perhaps one for the Finance Committee. Thank you very much.
Jamie and then Arabelle.
Thank you, Convener and Professor Spicker's paper, indeed Professor McHugh's paper. Both they talk about the parity principle in relation to the responsibilities of that have been devolved to Northern Ireland, and I was very taken with the comments that were put in your paper, Professor Spicker, where you say that such a principle would not be consistent with the remit of the Smith Commission to deliver more powers related to welfare and to strengthen the relative position of the Scottish Parliament in this field. For devolution to be possible to any degree, it has to be accepted that benefits in different parts of the United Kingdom might reasonably differ. And I think you were starting to get to the nub of that when you were talking about the point about housing benefit and matching it up with other areas of housing policy, the ability to do something different. But I wonder if you could just bottom this out a little more. Why do you think the idea of the parity principle is inconsistent with the remit of the Smith Commission?
As I understand the remit of the Smith Commission, it is to increase the powers. Now, it's possible to improve powers only in a strictly formal sense. In a strictly formal sense, Northern Ireland has complete control over its social security system. David's paper did refer to the legality of the parity principle. And the legality of the parity principle is that there should be consultation about variation. The reality of the parity principle is slightly different, and the quote that I gave from the Department of Social Development pretty much says that there can be no variation in terms of the criteria and form that benefits take, which go far beyond any question of consultation. Effectively, the way that the parity principle has been interpreted in Northern Ireland, it is to stop all variations, including any variation that may be considered to adapt to local circumstances and conditions. And that seems to me rather to defeat the point of devolution, that if you believe that there should be devolution, that devolution means that there should be some real delegated power, not simply legal authority, over what the circumstances are. And there are clear circumstances where the Scottish Parliament has shown a desire to vary those conditions, of which the bedroom tax is an illustration. I think it's a very good illustration because one of the reasons why the bedroom tax was introduced in England was because it was an attempt to rationalise the system in relation to rules for rent setting that applied in England but did not apply in Scotland. And we ended up with a situation in Scotland where the bedroom tax was taking very much more than could be attributed to any difference in the size of properties. So on its own terms, the bedroom tax failed. That's on its own terms, leaving aside all the other issues. I think there are many cases where we may reasonably wish to have some variation in conditions. And I gave a couple of examples in the paper of places where we may decide to go in that direction. But to do that, you have to break away from something like the parity principle. It seems to me that if the government, that is, if the current coalition were to be introducing now something in relation to a devolved Scotland of the sort in that there is in Northern Ireland, that it would be very easy for them to insist, as they have insisted for Northern Ireland, that certain rules were passed because they were being passed at UK level. An example is universal credit, where the claim has been made by the DWP that universal credit is likely to benefit the UK economy to the extent of £38 billion. People did ask me earlier today how that was broken down, and the answer is I haven't a clue. It seemed to me a figure that was entirely plucked out of the air. But if you work on that principle and then say to Scotland, you are not introducing this policy and therefore you are not gaining something in excess of £3 billion and you will suffer a penalty, that really would put Scotland over a barrel and would leave no option for the Parliament but to follow suit. I think there are already many pressures to convergence. We've talked about incremental change. We've talked about doing things gradually. The Republic of Ireland is not subject to the same regimes, but if you look at the history of many of the benefits in the Republic of Ireland, they have followed benefits in the United Kingdom almost in lockstep. I think the biggest difference is that they didn't follow us in relation to housing benefit. But they did follow us in relation to many other things, including the Beveridge reforms, including job seekers allowance. And one has to say, well, what are those pressures? Yes, there's a huge pressure to try to do things a particular way. And I think it then becomes extremely important to, as it were, to put one's hands on the levers and to say, this is the way that things might be done otherwise.
I mean, Dr. McCormick wanted to follow up, Jamie.
Thank you. Just a quick word to follow up on Northern Ireland. I suppose there are two big reasons for parity to be the default in Northern Ireland. One is, of course, the presence of unionist politicians in permanent five-party coalition in Northern Ireland, which means even those politicians who do want to diverge, it's impossible to really go much in that direction because of the nature of politics in Northern Ireland, which is a bit different here. And the second big reason, which has been hinted at, is Northern Ireland lacks the fiscal flexibility, even if it wanted to go down a route of divergence from Great Britain in some ways, other than marginal ways. And one would hope also that a further devolution settlement in Scotland would have the fiscal flexibility to allow divergence where appropriate, to allow the right balance of risks, costs and rewards to be put in place that gives Scotland the possibility of making different decisions where that's appropriate. And if you just think about, I personally don't think that this is going to be about, to begin with, big variations in benefit rates. I think it's much more likely that we will take an incremental approach, and maybe that changes in programme design can be made early that better reflect Scottish circumstances. In fact, we're talking here about different circumstances across Scotland. If you think about how the work programme largely doesn't serve the needs of places like Dundee or Western Bartonshire, which have weak labour markets, don't serve the needs of lone parents or disabled people very well because the conditionality regime just isn't suited for those people. There's lots we could do in a reformed welfare to work model, which would be about a different approach to investing in training or childcare, or a new conditionality regime that incentivises back to work in a different way and allows Scotland to bank most of those savings from better programme performance. That's not about changing benefit rates necessarily, which is quite expensive to do if you start to do it properly. But we might get better outcomes, we might get more sustainable job flows, we might end up with more affordable childcare along the way. There's lots of other outcomes we can get from a social investment approach, which further devolution could give us. But my colleagues are right that parity would not be the starting assumption in that kind of model.
Okay, Dr. Webster, and then I'll come back to the Deputy Convener.
Yes, just a quick point that it's important to remember that the significance of parity is completely different in Northern Ireland from what it would be in Scotland, because Northern Ireland only has about 80% of the income per head of the rest of the UK. Wales is in a similar position. So for them, what parity means is they're getting a social security system that they couldn't otherwise afford. And in that context, objecting to things like welfare reform is a relatively small grumble, because if they dissociated themselves from the UK social security system, matters would be very much worse. The situation with Scotland is it's got almost the same income per head as the rest of the UK, and therefore parity is about things like equal citizenship, mobility of labour, clarity of entitlement and so on and so forth. It's not about a major redistribution of resources.
Thank you, Dr. Webster. That's a helpful point. I suppose the point then that has been made is that whether the system changes incrementally or if it changes at all, the decision-making responsibility should be invested. If devolution comes, it should be invested in this Parliament. It shouldn't be, the UK government shouldn't have the ability to compel this Parliament to legislate in areas that are devolved. Is that's the essential point you were making, Professor Spicker, correct?
Sorry, could you repeat the point?
The point you're making, and to pick up on Dr. McCormick's point, where it could only be over a period of time that matters change, or if they change at all, that's a decision that should be invested here, and it shouldn't be predicated on the assumption that we can't change, that we're encumbered in some way by decisions made in another place.
I think that it's impossible not to be encumbered by those decisions.
So not encumbered, I suppose directed is the point, I mean, rather than encumbered.
I think that come what may, that there will be attempts to direct whatever a Scottish Parliament does, and that would be true, it seems to me, almost regardless of the institutional arrangements. Why do I say so? Because, as I said, we've seen basically what happened when the Republic of Ireland, as a fully independent country, was seeking itself to do things, but was constantly referring across the border, making comparisons, trying to make decisions with a great deal of influence being exerted at all times. I think the question you're on is that do I endorse the principle of devolution? It seems to me that if there is to be any devolution, then it must be on certain terms. And to that extent, I would say that it's not possible to have a purely formalistic arrangement of the sort that applies in Northern Ireland and to achieve any of the objectives to which, as far as I understand, all the main parties are now committed in the process of the Smith Commission. And to that extent, I would say yes. But I think this does take a certain caution. Yes, there is an alternative view put by John Kay, which is that you have the alternative of holding everything at UK level and looking for devolution of powers elsewhere. I do think that that would be very difficult within the current situation. I think it's extremely difficult to sustain. And I would go back to the point that David Webster made right at the start with that, which is, well, we've already got a degree of devolution. We're already operating differently in some ways, and it doesn't necessarily make quite the simple sense that it seems to make if you just look at if you started from that position.
Okay, Nicola, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that anyone is on the Commission may be seriously arguing for parity on the Northern Ireland model. I don't think anyone thinks that's suitable for Scotland. But one of the suggestions that has been made is about...
That, though, just sorry, I don't mean to intervene, just to go back to Professor Spicker's point, and notwithstanding the comments you just made about all the parties being committed, you did make the point that the UK government's command paper said there should be uniform terms of rates of benefits, of benefit for all benefits, which seems inconsistent with the Smith Commission.
Well, sorry, I don't know if you want to...
No, sorry, yeah. I'm still taking...
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the suggestions that has been made is about a minimum standard, you know, so having a baseline with the option of flexibility, top-up benefits, for example. And I would be slightly wary of that if that also implied constraints, in other words, you know, minimising the extent to which any of the redesigns that might be beneficial could take place. I had another point, and it's escaped me. Oh, yes. So, but on the point about whether, your question about whether Scotland could be compelled constitutionally, no. But I think it's really important to link this to the points that David was making earlier about how you finance social security devolution. At the moment, social security is financed according to demand. Now, how to do that in the context of devolution will be very difficult, particularly if the benefits, the system diverges. Would it be on the basis of how it diverges in Scotland? Probably not. Would it be on the basis of some form of counterfactual? Probably yes. And that counterfactual might be what would be spent on benefits were devolution of social security not in place. So there you would still have an interaction between what's already happening at the UK level and how much resources were made available to the Scottish Government to spend on its social security competences. So the way in which social security devolution is financed is crucially important to how the two things interact.
So the devolution of wider fiscal responsibilities is presumably...
Well, that's in the absence of full fiscal autonomy. I mean, even if you have full income tax devolution, it's not going to be sufficient in itself to finance social security devolution. There would need to still be a fiscal transfer of some kind.
Just add that under the current rules, under the Scotland Act, that pretty much all activities relating to the distribution of financial assistance to individuals are reserved. And that means that there's a great deal which Scotland might think it appropriate to do, that the Scottish Parliament might think it appropriate to do, which are simply counted out of court. In the submission which I put, I gave an illustrative example entirely plucked out of the air of a new benefit, a funeral grant. And the question is not, should we have a funeral grant? The question is, should Scotland have the power to decide whether or not it is able to do things which are out with the current pattern of existing benefit provision? And it does seem to me puzzling that an English local authority could do so, but that the Scottish Parliament cannot.
Annabelle, to be followed by Ken.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon. I think the debate's been very interesting, and obviously there are many different issues involved. We've just got on to fiscal transfers. very important to the other side of the balance sheet. I wanted to suggest maybe in terms of the transfer of welfare powers, we should maybe be considering this from first principles, not what suits Westminster, but what are we trying to do? And a couple of the participants, the panellists this morning, have referred to the expert working group in welfare, and of course they identified key first principles, powers for purpose, which was that there should be an effective social security system to further social cohesion, and that the social security system should be a safety net, but importantly they also recognise that it should be a springboard. And I think that, obviously written in the context of full powers independence, but I think those principles nonetheless surely are still relevant to our discussion, and they would suggest to me that they would tend to mitigate against a piecemeal tick box housing benefit attendance allowance nothing else approach, because it fails to take into account the interaction of the benefits, with other policy areas, and therefore defeats securing these, I think, worthy objectives of what a social security system should be about. And I just wonder if that has informed any of the thinking of any of the panellists as they have come up with their submissions.
Anyone want to take that one? Jim?
So I think that is a good reminder, Annabelle, to go back to the expert working group. I mean, it talked about fairness and simplicity and personalisation and various principles. Of course, some of which there are trade-offs. So making progress under one of those headings means that something else may not be progressed in the same way, but nonetheless, they're good principles. There's also one about affordability, which might strike us as a bit surprising, but it's quite important that we say this. I think that it's back to my point about where are the pressure points in the system. Some parts of social security are about contributing across our lifetimes in order to benefit when we are older or sick or disabled. They are different from income-based benefits, which are about when we fall in hard times for other reasons. So there's a mix of functions going on, a mix of payment types going on. And the affordability point, I think, should be we should stop paying for market failures wherever possible. And we see market failures in parts of the housing market. We see it in parts of the labour market. And in childcare, for example, childcare is expensive, it's of patchy quality, we have poor controls over workforce quality and so on. So there are lots of underlying pressures in our system where we end up paying the cost through the benefit system, where over time we need to pay less of that cost if, for example, we invested more directly in the supply of affordable housing, more directly in the supply of affordable childcare and so on. So I'm keen that we look at the underlying costs, what's the trajectory, how might Scotland be more effective in the UK and international context at tackling those costs. And to do that, we need to be moving towards what would be called international social investment approach, which is prioritising progression into well-paid work, prioritising lower cost, higher quality childcare, and making sure housing costs are under control. So those are the ways in which we can, over time, make sure we are managing those parts of social security where we would want to be keeping costs under control, as well as addressing the other principles you talked about: fairness, simplicity, transparency.
Anyone else want to? Ken?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reinforce what Jim's saying. It seems to me that this is about kind of Christie principle of preventative spending to some extent, that we can't look at welfare spending in isolation. It's how it works as a system to improve the assets that exist in society, and we think in a more holistic way about ways in which interventions to tackle market failures, to tackle big structural problems in society are used in a coherent, positive way, and that, one wouldn't want to unendingly increase the level of welfare spending when it's dealing with symptomatic problems rather than causes of the issues. I just really wanted to just reinforce that point.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Ken. Certainly around the preventative spending, that has been an issue that the Scottish Parliament has dealt with over a number of years now, and it's quite a difficult issue to actually pin down
what it really means, and it's also relatively long term. You don't see the benefits of preventative spending for quite a long period of time. So you've got to be able to say that, yeah, this might be a beneficial trajectory for Scotland to follow. But there may be periods of time on the interim where you might doubt that you're actually going to achieve what it is that you've set out to achieve, and you've just got to stick with it. So this is not something that you can suddenly go from point A to point B over a very short period of time. It's a long-term project.
Annabelle?
Thank you for that. I mean, I guess that we're looking at preventative spend. Then, if we're only going to have a piecemeal tick box devolution of welfare powers, that's inherently self-limiting to progressing the objectives of preventative spend, because there'll be inherent limitations on what you can do. But one other issue, if I may, Convener, which I don't think has been touched on yet this morning, but certain panellists have raised it in their submissions, which is the issue of devolution of employment policies, including in particular the ability to set minimum wage and so forth. And I just wonder, because I don't think all panellists commented on that in their submission, written submission, it would just be interesting to hear views on that area.
I think I did comment.
You did?
On, yes, yeah. I don't have any problem with setting a minimum wage differently in different parts of the UK, indeed, and therefore that would, it seems to me, be quite appropriate for Scotland. It's already been talked about in the context of London, and it seems to me that that's the sort of power. The evidence that is out there that it might have a very negative effect on employment, which is often the argument that's put forward, is pretty weak. And indeed, you know, it was quite surprising, but yesterday the CBI argued in favour of increasing the wages of the lower paid. So this is not something that I think would threaten the stability of the UK if you're looking at it from that perspective, and it would be an interesting responsibility to see how the Scottish Parliament might handle.
Ken?
Yeah, it's just to say that I think one of the interesting ways that this links to the previous issue is, of course, that in recent years we've seen this huge growth in housing benefit for people in work, and so in the UK it's risen by more than 100% in terms of number of people who are in work and receive housing benefit, and clearly that's a way of mitigating in-work poverty to some extent. So in a sense we have the welfare system playing a role that you might argue that the minimum wage could be playing in a different way, and they are combining it to some extent. So again, these things are a seamless web, you know, they all link up.
Anyone else?
That's something about the work programme. It would be obviously very easy and practical to devolve the work programme and related areas as it currently stands. The difficulty we have is that the work programme and a number of its predecessors have not worked at all. That if we look at the figures, then they have consistently fallen short of expectations. There is a great question about whether they are actually adding any value to the overall system. I think that there is indeed an argument for uncoupling employment and employability provision altogether from the benefit system. It seems to me that basically it's had a negative effect on the benefit system, and the benefit system has had a negative effect on employment and employability provision. When we come to employability, we're often not really talking about the world of work so much as we're talking about lots of issues related to social inclusion, and there's a very particularly strong argument in that case for trying to establish appropriate support for people who have the greatest problems of exclusion and who require the most support, and to bring that to a much more local level.
Okay. Annabelle? Okay, I'll move on to Ken McIntosh then.
Thank you. Excellent point to pick up on, just that this idea of housing benefit, the increase there, and also about where that money comes from. I think both Nicola McCune and David Bell talked about annually managed expenditure, and the difficulty in that. I think other contributors did too. The difficulty in coming up with a formula, a mathematical formula, back to that, Have either of you or any of the panellists got a suggestion as to how, I suppose, fairness can be maintained while still devolving cyclical benefits such as those?
David?
I actually, in a previous version of the paper, had a number of formulae, but I think it was Nicola who managed to persuade me to take them out. There's a big issue here because one of the other functions of social security spending is to act as a stabilizer in the economy as a whole, so that if there is a rise in unemployment because of a recession of some kind, spending increases to compensate for that. Now, and then that also is you could think of it as a kind of insurance policy that exists. So it seems to me that you have the issue of, with those kinds of risks that you're covering that are close to the market and the performance of the economy as a whole, then you have a little bit more difficulty in trying to figure out how you could just hand over the money for those benefits and make it a fixed sum, say, over a period of time, and then a recession hits, and how do you deal with that issue? It's less of an issue on things like, say, attendance allowance, which is an insurance policy, and the risk that you face is disability, and that actually won't vary all that much. So this issue of benefits which are sensitive in a sense to the way that the economy is performing have to be handled pretty carefully. And indeed, maybe it's also true that the overall welfare bill has to be thought about very carefully, because that's about a third of total public expenditure. Whether you'd be talking about an independent Scotland or the UK as a whole, if an independent Scotland carried on with existing policies, that would be about the size of it. And so you've got this issue of, should there be an overall control over the amount of money that is being sent to Scotland to allow it to pursue its own welfare policies. And I would suspect that although you might have a workable formulae that would work from year to year, there would need to be some overall cover to ensure that public spending as a whole didn't become unsustainable, or that on the other hand, if the economy got into big trouble, there still would be perhaps a bigger flow should there be a very negative shock to the economy. So that I think does need some complicated formula. I'm not sure my ones were the right ones, but there we are.
I mentioned earlier about the possibility of establishing a counterfactual. So what would the expenditure have been under the existing system that we have now, and then using that as a basis for transfer. Now that becomes much more difficult, I think. Any sort of AMI type system becomes much more difficult if some powers and responsibilities are also devolved within England, which is also a possibility that might be coming further down the line. Another option, I guess, is to shift it to a DEL expenditure, to make it essentially an opt-out of a UK programme with fiscal compensation for that. But then you have the problem that David was talking about with geographic shocks and how you manage those. I know that DWP they told me about it, were aware of a system in the Netherlands where they have a equivalent of JSA, which is managed at the local level, and there is a mechanism, like a solidarity pact, that if you vary in an area beyond a certain percentage of the average, if the burden becomes greater than a certain percentage of the average, then there's a mechanism for having an additional supplementary payment. So there will be ways to manage it, but I think, I mean, I mentioned it in my paper just because I think it's absolutely crucial that if those cyclical benefits are devolved, that there is some mechanism in place to manage those risks, which could go in either direction. That also might mean that Scotland might be expected to contribute in reverse if the shocks are felt elsewhere.
Just on something else you said earlier, Nicola, about the appetite for reform in Scotland, and that I think David Webster pointed out that we've had council tax, social fund, bedroom tax all been devolved, and various taxes too, for that matter. But they haven't actually been reformed at all, or not, certainly not radically. Really, what's happened is that we've mitigated against any the bad effects of reforms elsewhere. What do you think we need to do? I know this is sort of going ahead a bit, but what do we need to do to actually reform? And if we agree that some of these policies do need reform, but all we're doing is actually acting in a very conservative with a small c style, what do you think we need to do? Is it about the principle which we need to apply about devolving policies, rather than picking one or two for political reasons? Is it a principled approach we should take all working age policies, or all housing policies, or all pensioner policies, or all disability or incapacity policies? I mean, do you think that we're going about it the right way here?
I mean, the arguments that were made around attendance allowance and housing benefit were about the links with areas that are already devolved. And yes, I can see that, but you can probably say that about almost any aspect of social security. It has a link with social policy, which is already devolved. And I think that those two in particular have been selected, I think, partly because of their symbolic significance with the bedroom tax and with free personal care. So I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do it. I'm not sure what is the right way to do it. A more principled approach would be nice, and maybe it is about identifying client groups to avoid some of the inevitable complexities that are coming if changing one bit of a system and the knock-on effects for another. But I'm afraid one of the things that I do think we need, I don't have the magic formula that are the answers, Paul might, but I think one of the things that we need to do is invest in policy capacity to start to innovate and develop new policy ideas that are suitable for a Scottish environment, and we don't have that yet.
I think, Paul, you were nodding there as if you wanted to maybe contribute.
Yeah, I'm nodding. Let's say that I very much, agreed with your question, and also I think Nicola has made the point that it has to be about devolution in relation to functions rather than specific benefits. There's a very serious risk that if what we do is cherry pick 3 or 4 benefits, we fix everything as it is. The greatest risk of that is with housing benefit, which has been let's say, extremely difficult to reform over 40 years when it's never actually worked properly. And that's because you build up dependencies on the benefit which make it hugely difficult to change. The fact is that housing benefit is now our principal means of supporting social housing, but it's not designed for the purpose, and in many ways it's not fit for the purpose, but we're stuck with it. It becomes very difficult then, being sort of out on the lake with a leaky raft, to say, oh, we shouldn't have set out this way. But time and again we find ourselves actually being stuck with benefits because they are the way that they are. We need to understand that lots of benefits have lots of overlaps. I am rather concerned about the idea, for example, that we may have the devolution of income tax but not have the devolution of child benefit. Those two run very closely together. Child benefit is at least, in very substantial part, the equivalent of the child tax allowance and is treated as such for many purposes. And the idea, basically, that we try to uncouple them in that way could, it seems to me, cause huge problems, especially when, as things currently stand, the tax system is being used to moderate entitlement to child benefit. But there are... Quite simply, we've got to start looking at these things as packages. And it's only when we've got the package that we can start to think about what we really need to do, which is often to reallocate at a Scottish level or at a local level certain types of expenditure so that they better serve their purposes.
Jim, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah. I think there's a question that we've kind of danced around here today, which is where would we all set the boundary? And that's a question of judgment, and it should be led by tests and principles and directions and outcomes, rather than unpicking bits of the settlement because they look doable or politically lower risk. Or so in our response to Smith Commission, it's not comprehensive, but we've tried to say, we might want to have an offer around work, an offer around housing, an offer around childcare. And although the bulk of that is about working age benefits, it's not quite as simple as saying, and we're not doing older people, because a large share of housing benefit goes to older people, and that might go into pension credit in future based on UK government plans. And there are things around winter fuel payments and even cold weather allowances, which are quite small in the scheme of things, but you could still make them fit better to Scottish circumstances if they were devolved. You can make winter fuel payments taxable, for example, so you can target them without using a means test. So taking an approach to, what is the objective long-term we seek to achieve, and therefore what's the kind of thematic offer, I think is quite a promising way to go about it. The important, it almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, the important part of this is of course, that the fiscal responsibility and accountability theme has to go hand in hand with whichever powers we're devolving, and Paul's right. I mean, this can't just be about income tax powers. It almost certainly has to be a mix of an AME settlement, maybe some DEL settlement too, income tax and other taxes. Assigned revenues ought to be in this mix. They're not as straightforward in terms of autonomy, but they can still give you short to medium term some important breathing space in terms of your budget flexibility. So the more resilient, the more robust, the lower risk the fiscal settlement is, the more we can start adapting these different thematic offers to Scottish circumstances, I think.
Okay. Just to add something about resilience and robustness from the point of view of claimants. One of the great difficulties we've made for ourselves is going for huge portmanteau benefits, throwing in one rule after another into, so that we, for example, ESA now includes sickness benefit, includes severe disablement allowance, it includes effectively provision for early retirement. We try to do with it all at once. The almost immediate effect of that is, from the point of view of claimants, that they become extremely dependent on specific individual benefits in a specific individual form. And it becomes hugely difficult to change things, but it also makes them hugely vulnerable at points where those benefits get stopped. I've argued in the submission for moving for a more fragmented system, which is certainly not a popular position. By fragmenting, what it becomes possible to do is to seek to adjust at a smaller level without creating the situation where it is devastating for a claimant to lose all their money at once.
Yeah, I've seen that paper and a lot of sympathy for that. Can I just ask another question to David Webster? Because David, you presented a slightly different analysis, which was that quite a political one actually, which was to recognise that if on the one hand you accept the principle, which clearly won't be accepted by everybody, that we pay into the United Kingdom through our taxes and we take out of it through pooled benefits and pensions and so on. If you want to maintain that but still address the fact that there's huge political friction over the, as you call them, the neoliberal reforms which have been driven through by the current administration at the UK, then what's needed is a flexibility. In other words, you keep the current system, but you have, I think, a flexibility. And I think you were suggesting that we have the ability to either, I'm not sure, it was to top up effectively by up to 10% or something like that. Is that so what we've done with the bedroom tax, but across all benefits?
Yes. Yes, I'm suggesting that there should be a general power to vary social security provisions subject to some overall limit, which I suggest might be 10% of expenditure, which would have to be either way, I think. I suppose the question arises about that. What about if Scotland wanted to do a total redesign of some aspect of the benefit system, and it actually cost the same? So you would suddenly get dramatic divergence, and it would be allowed within the system. Well, I suppose I have to say I'd be happy with that, actually. Happy, but a bit sceptical about whether that would be attainable, because my experience, I mean, I'm retired now, but I did work for 40 years or so in housing, which was a lot of it was about social security, and the fact is most systems have something wrong with them. I mean, governments come along and they propose radical reforms, and they do indeed deal with certain deficiencies in the current system and so on, but they tend to introduce other problems. And so I think one's got to be sceptical about whether the ideal of a total redesign, which costs the same, is actually, or costs no more than 10% more or less, whether that's attainable. But I don't see why the Scottish Parliament should be prevented from doing that. If it wanted to, I mean, it would in effect then be acting as a laboratory for innovation in social security, which I think would be thoroughly healthy.
What about the power without any limit, just the power to vary any?
So the power to...
So in other words, that Scotland operates within the UK, but with the power to vary any welfare benefit that it so chooses.
Yes, well, that's what I'm suggesting.
But I think you're not suggesting that there might be a cap, a parity, as of Northern Ireland.
Well, I think there should be an overriding principle that the object should be, the long-term object should be a common social security system, but recognise that there will be differences of opinion about what social security provision should be, and some provision for variation and flexibility. And I think that therefore it wouldn't be a parity. You have to restate the parity principle. You'd have to restate the object as being common citizenship, facilitating mobility of labour and so on, but within that power to vary the system. And that might conceivably involve quite radical change, because, I mean, I think Ken is certainly suggesting that although in principle it might be possible to design a much better housing benefit system, in practice one would be rather sceptical about embarking on that path. But if the Scottish Parliament felt, after considering everything, that in fact there was a much better system to be had at broadly similar cost, and that the benefits outweighed what would obviously be considerable upheaval and development costs and everything, computer systems, which are obviously a major source of problems in trying to innovate in social security, then I don't see why it shouldn't go ahead. And then it would be suck it and see, wouldn't it, if the system, in fact, over a decade or two worked a lot better than the UK system, the UK probably want to adopt the Scottish system.
I suppose the attraction of it, if Scotland is given the power to vary any benefit, I'm not sure that there needs to be a limit on that, in the sense that I think several contributors have pointed out that we have the power to vary many taxes and many benefits already, and we choose not to use them. The Republic of Ireland has chosen to follow the example of its neighbours. But the point is, they have the choice. So we could have the choice. It wouldn't necessarily mean breaking up the. I mean, does it necessarily lead to the breakup of the welfare system, or does it necessarily lead to the breakup of the principle that we are pooling and sharing resources if we have just unlimited power to change the benefits?
What you think needs changed. So if your gripe is with the level of benefits, then that power to vary the level of benefits might be satisfactory. If your gripe is with the system of benefits or the principles underlying the system, then obviously the power to vary would not allow you to do anything about those issues. I mean, I think there's an underlying issue about self-government here, which isn't necessarily about the power to change, but it's about the power to decide. You might decide to do things in a very similar way, or you might end up doing things in a very similar way because of all the constraints that have already been mentioned and presented, and public pressure too. But nevertheless, this Parliament would have that power to decide what to do if that was one of the principles underlying this. And I think people are coming to the table around devolution of all sorts of areas with different principles in mind and different long-term objectives, and that's part of the challenge, I think.
Okay, Jim and then Paul.
Really briefly, I think there probably ought to be a red line around the National Insurance Fund and contributory benefits, because those are benefits which we contribute to and can receive on the basis of our contributions, not the basis of our country of residence. So I would be arguing for a red line around the National Insurance Fund. In fact, I'd like to see it improved and enhanced rather than whittled away, as has happened in recent decades. But that for other benefits, so with those benefits, you could have the power to supplement them, but I would argue not to vary the base rate, because those are based on a different contributory basis. But when we talk about other income-based benefits, then the power to vary, ideally with as much integration as possible, is a kind of different order of issue from state pension, contributory GSA, contributory disability benefits, I would say.
Paul?
I was going to add that there's actually very limited scope to top up or vary rates of benefits in administrative terms. That in administrative terms, what happens, basically, we can't have a benefit which is distributed simultaneously by two agencies. It has to become two benefits. You've got to have then, within one system, the capacity to identify who is entitled as opposed to who is not entitled, and you've also got to have the variation of conditions, circumstances or levels of benefits then applied to those people, which means that there's got to be the capacity for a dual system. Now, in lots of our benefits, quite simply, they're not built that way. And it would be hugely difficult in practice to do it. So one of the reasons why this might be very little used is that when it actually comes down to cases, the ability of the agencies that exist to do it might just not be there.
Okay. We're really up against the clock. Thanks to Dr. McCormick for his contribution. Are there any issues that any of our panel wanted to discuss this morning when they came that haven't been touched on? I think we've had quite a broad spectrum, but if there's any points you want to make in conclusion, I'd be happy to hear them just now. No. We will come back to this, because obviously the Smith Commission will be reporting, and we'll continue to look at their findings and any issues surrounding that. But thanks very much to all of you for your contributions in the papers. Look forward to yours, Professor Gibb, when it becomes available. It'll be useful to us in our deliberations as we go forward. But thanks very much to everyone. Our next meeting will be on the 18th of November, and we'll hear evidence on the budget and consider our draft report on the Welfare Reform Scotland Bill. And I'll close the meeting at that point. Thank you.